On November 12, 1995, an American Airlines MD-83 carrying 78 passengers and crew is making its final approach to Bradley International Airport in Connecticut. It's running late, and the crew are eager to make it to the airport. The area is blanketed by torrential rain and turbulence, and the two pilots are struggling to keep the aircraft on course. The winds are so strong that the control tower had to be evacuated and is now occupied by a lone supervisor who hasn't manned a tower in years. Fighting severe turbulence, the pilots struggle to see the runway through the rain. A small mistake they made. Minutes beforehand would now come back to haunt them as they start to slip below their minimum descent altitude. This is one of those rare cases where nearly everything that could go wrong did go wrong. The story of American 1572 is without a doubt one of the strangest and most shocking incidents in American aviation, and it resulted in some important ideas for change across the industry. If you'd like to discover some important ideas for your life, then you might like Blinkist. Blinkist is an app on your phone that allows you to understand the key insights and ideas of a load nonfiction books by giving you short 15-minute summaries of them called blinks. So I was just listening to a book called The Flight by Dan Hampton, and that's about Charles Lindbergh's solo flight across the Atlantic Ocean in 1927. And I realized reading it how incredibly risky this journey was at the time, which is kind of hard to grasp now given how easy it is to cross the Atlantic nowadays. So Lindbergh was the first person to cross the Atlantic non-stop in a plane. They're really the first person to survive that crossing. There are many who tried before him, and I didn't actually know this before reading the book, but he actually had to use a periscope to see out the front of the aircraft because his windscreen was blocked by his fuel tank. So that was a biography, but Blinkist also has summaries of over 5,000 other non-fiction books. So I also liked reading Talking to Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell, which is about how bad we are judging people we know a little about, and also Blueprint by Nicholas Kostakis, which is about how our genes shape who we are as a species. So I know that many of you are curious about how things work. I think you like the technical aspects of these videos. So I really think you'll get a lot of value out of the short 15-minute summaries that Blinkist has on their app, and just for Green Dot viewers, Blinkers to giving away a 7-day free trial and 25 off a premium membership, which you can get right now if you sign up using the link below on November 12, 1995, 73 passengers boarded American Airlines Flight 1572 at Chicago's O'Hare Airport. The flight was bound for Bradley International Airport in Hartford, Connecticut, a 2-hour journey. It was a terrible night to be flying with heavy rains, thunderstorms, and howling winds buffeting much of the eastern half of the United States. Because of the weather, there were widespread delays and flight cancellations. Flight 1572 was due to depart Chicago at 25 minutes past 9. However, because of the weather, the flood was delayed by almost 2 hours. Finally, at around 10:45 that night, Flight 1572 pushed back from the gate, and the 73 passengers and 5 crew began their journey to Connecticut. They were not to know that in less than 2 hours their lives would hang in the balance as the captain did everything he could to save the aircraft. The captain of this flight was 39-year-old Kenneth Lee. Lee had 8,000 hours of flying experience, over 4,000 of which run the MD-80. He had previously flown for the U.S. Air Force before joining American Airlines in 1986. The first officer, John Richards, was 38 years old and had just over 5,000 hours of flying experience under his belt, around 2,000, of which were on the MD-80. He had been hired by American in 1989 and, like the captain, he had flown for the U.S. Air Force for many years. Before this, the captain would be flying the aircraft for this leg of the journey, which would be the crew's second and last flight of the day. The aircraft being used for this flight was an 8-year-old McDonnell Douglas MD-83, a reliable short to medium-haul jet which competed with the Airbus A320 and Boeing 737. American Airlines was the world's largest operator of MD-80 aircraft, with over 300 of the type in service during the 1990s. The jet, was the backbone of America's domestic fleet, and to this day it has one of the best safety records of any passenger aircraft. At 5 minutes past 11, the flight lifted off and climbed into the stormy skies above Chicago 15 minutes later as the aircraft neared its cruising altitude of 33,000 feet. The pilots received a message from American Airlines dispatch. It provided them with the weather information at Bradley, which included strong gusting winds and rapidly falling atmospheric pressure. The atmospheric pressure is a vitally important piece of information for pilots. Their altimeter, which shows their altitude above sea level, uses outside air pressure to determine the plane's altitude. The higher, the plane climbs. The lower the air pressure is outside. In other words, the lower the air pressure outside the aircraft, the higher the altimeters think the aircraft is. This means that when the pressure of the atmosphere itself is low, as it was on this night, the altimeter interprets this as the aircraft being higher than it actually is. To account for this, pilots receive up-to-date information from air traffic control on the current air pressure and twist a knob in the cockpit which calibrates the altimeter to the current atmospheric pressure outside. A few minutes after receiving this weather information, the pilots reached their cruising altitude of 33,000 feet. The flight progressed more or less as normal during the cruise, with the captain climbing up to 35,000 feet at one point to avoid an area of turbulence about an hour later. At midnight, the aircraft began its descent towards Bradley. The captain then addressed the passengers, telling them to expect turbulence all the way down to landing and to take their seats. Now, this would be a high workload approach for the pilots. They would be landing on runway 15 at Bradley, which didn't have an instrument landing system. This meant they had to fly a more old-fashioned kind of approach known as a VOR approach. This required them to make intensive use of their charts, compass altimeter, and distance measuring equipment, as they'd have to make sure that they are at certain altitudes at particular distances from the airport. They would have to do this while flying at night in the clouds and in some of the worst turbulence that an aircraft can encounter at one point during the descent. The captain said to the first officer, "I'll tell you, flying at night, I don't like it. Worth it, the weather." At Bradley was changing rapidly, and at 12:30, the American Airlines dispatcher sent the following message to the captain: "Attention, Captain. Lee have information from Bradley Tower that aircraft have been making landings, but have advised of turbulence and low-level wind shear on final winds are more aligned with runway at Boston. If that becomes necessary, the aircraft was being thrown about by turbulence, and given how strong the winds were, a diversion to Boston was becoming a distinct possibility." The weather update from American Airlines also included a new atmospheric pressure of 29.42 inches of mercury. Inches of mercury is the unit for air pressure. It comes from the fact that when you put mercury inside a glass tube, it rises and falls along with the air pressure. The standard atmospheric pressure is 29.92 inches of mercury. Anything lower than that is considered low pressure, and anything higher is considered high pressure by calibrating their altimeters to 29.42. During the descent, the pilots could tell the aircraft's actual altitude above sea level at American Airlines. It was standard procedure at the time for pilots to set their standby altimeter to the actual air pressure, in this case 29.42, which caused it to display their altitude above sea level, and during the approach to set their main altimeters to a made-up pressure setting, which adjusted for the airport's height above sea level for this flight, as Bradley Airport's elevation above sea level was 174 feet. The pilots would set their primary altimeters to 29.23, as this would cause a difference between the two altimeters of 174 feet. This meant that when they touched down at Bradley, their main altimeters would read 0 feet instead of 174. The advantage of this method was that it standardized all approaches. No matter what airport a crew was flying into, their altimeters would always show similar readings during the approach, and they would always read 0 on touchdown. If you're wondering why I'm going into all this technical detail about altitude and air pressure, you'll see shortly why it mattered so much on this night. Shortly after receiving this weather update from American Airlines and still descending, the first officer tuned into Bradley's Automatic Terminal Information Service, or ATIS, and listened to the weather information at the airport. It said that the pressure at Bradley was 29, 50, that both runways were wet, and that there was severe turbulence below 10,000 feet. The word severe in this context is not used lightly. In fact, there are rigidly defined criteria for the 4 levels of turbulence experienced in aviation light: moderate, severe, and extreme. You may think you've been in severe turbulence before, but the chances are that was just light, or moderate turbulence in severe turbulence. The forces on the aircraft are so strong, the pilots momentarily lose control of the aircraft, and anybody not strapped in is thrown to the ceiling. This would be a very challenging approach for the pilots and a nerve-wracking one for the passengers. The first officer described the weather he was hearing to the captain, and the captain noted that the information on the AT ice was an hour and a half old. The previous report they had received from the dispatcher was actually more up to date, with the atmospheric pressure falling rapidly. It would be important for the pilots to receive more up-to-date information as they neared the airport, wanting to ensure that his colleagues spotted any mistakes during this high workload approach. The captain said, "Just watch me the whole way. All right? Yeah, man. You got it. Any comments? Scream out. You're going to get a lot of turbulence. You know how to land it." As it would turn out, this warning from the captain was well advised. Shortly after this, air traffic control instructed the flight to descend to 11,000 feet, and the controller informed the pilots of an updated pressure setting of 29, 40 inches of mercury. This was from a weather observation done at 11:30, which was more than an hour old by this point. However, it was still more up to date than the other reports the pilots had gotten by now. The actual air pressure had fallen much lower and was still dropping. In fact, the aircraft was now more than 50 feet lower than its altimeters were indicating at their current altitude. This difference was insignificant, but as they descended towards the airport in rain and poor visibility, this would end up being fateful. A few minutes later, still descending towards 11,000 feet, the flight crew were going through the before-landing checklist when the first officer called out altimeters. The captain said 2950, which was the pressure setting previously identified by him as being 90 minutes out of date. The first officer attempted to correct him, saying they called 2947. "When we started down, whatever you want," the captain replied. Okay, while the first officer was correct that the captain had mentioned an outdated altimeter setting. For some reason, he had misremembered the new altimeter setting that air traffic control had provided him. During the descent, the controller had said it was 2940, but the first officer had remembered this as 29.47. This figure of 29.47, when fed into the altimeter, made it display an altitude which is about 40 feet higher than the correct setting would read. However, even though the first officer put his misremembered 29.47 into the standby altimeter, he still put the correctly remembered, albeit still outdated, altimeter setting of 29.23 into their main altimeters to account for the airport elevation. This discordance between the two altimeters should not have been a problem. As part of their checklist during the approach, the pilots were due to confirm that the difference between the altitude on their main altimeters and the one displaying on their standby altimeters equaled the airport elevation above sea level. So at least for the moment, this was not an issue. The atmospheric pressure was still falling rapidly. By the time the pilots were on their final approach, the true atmospheric pressure would have fallen to just 24 inches of mercury, leading to their altimeters displaying an altitude which was over 40 feet higher than their actual altitude. As you can see from this graph, the pilots' altimeter settings were now doubly wrong. The actual air pressure was lower than the one that air traffic control had available to them, which was lower still than the one that the pilots were using on board. As they continued their descent, the pilots began briefing the approach for runway 15 at Bradley. Here's a copy of the approach chart they were using. The captain pointed out that the airport elevation was 174 feet above sea level and confirmed this with the first officer. However, the pilots didn't notice that the difference between their standby altimeter and the primary altimeter was 240 feet. Instead of the airport elevation of 174 feet, This was because the first officer had put an incorrect pressure setting of 29.47 in the standby altimeter rather than the one the controller had provided him with, which was 29.40. Spotting this discrepancy would have provided the pilots with an opportunity to ask air traffic control for the latest pressure setting at Bradley. However, they never did this. The flight was now nearing the airport, and at 1:45, the first officer contacted approach control, who cleared them to descend to 4,000 feet. The controller provided the pilots with the current wind speed and direction. The wind was coming from 170 degrees at a speed of 29 knots, ghosting to 39 knots. The cockpit voice recorder recorded the pilots laughing upon hearing this, with the first officer saying, "Well, you got enough gas to go back while the direction of this wind was fine, almost straight down the runway. It was strong and gusting to 39 knots, which is over 70 kilometers an hour. The winds were so strong, in fact, that the windows in the control tower had started flexing and letting in rainwater. As a result of this, the tower had to be evacuated without a tower controller to give the aircraft a landing clearance. The approach controller would be the last controller to officially speak to the aircraft, in addition to providing the wind information. The controller should have provided the atmospheric pressure when the pilots initially made contact with him. Not only was this required by regulations, but it would have been prudent given how quickly the pressure was falling. Nonetheless, he simply forgot to include this information. By this point, the latest air pressure information he had available to him was 29.38, which would soon drop to 29.36. Had he given this information to the pilots, they could have readjusted their altimeters, which would reduce their apparent altitude by 60 feet. In other words, because of the controller's error, the pilots were now 60 feet lower than they thought they were. As we'll see, this would end up being crucial on this night. The controller then cleared the crew for the approach to runway 15. About 15 miles from the airport, the crew were at 3,500 feet and lined up with the runway. The captain turned on the weather radar, which is a small antenna located in the nose of the aircraft. It swept out a cone-shaped piece of sky in front of the aircraft. He observed that there were no thunderstorms ahead, so he turned off the radar. He was using the autopilot to fly the aircraft at this point, using the VOR localizer mode, in which the autopilot tries to direct the aircraft with reference to radio beacons on the ground. However, due to the strong winds, the autopilot was unable to keep the aircraft on course. At this point, the captain changed the autopilot to the heading select mode and turned the dial to manually direct the aircraft back to a heading where it could fly towards the runway. The pilots had now fully set up the aircraft for landing. The flaps were lowered to 40 degrees, and the landing gear were down and locked. Following the approach chart, the captain then began descending to 2,000 feet. The aircraft was being tossed around in the strong winds, and rain was pelting the windscreens. The 73 passengers were now eagerly awaiting to be back on the ground. They were less than 5 minutes from landing. The approach controller then told the pilots that there was now somebody in the tower, and that while it was, quote, not really officially open, the crew could change to the tower frequency and speak to them. The pilots then switched over to the tower frequency on their radios. The person in the tower was a supervisor who hadn't manned the tower position in 3 years. He had stayed back to ensure that the flight made it in safely. As he wasn't officially a tower controller, he couldn't legally clear the plane to land. The captain would have to land the plane entirely under his own authority. The plane had now reached 2,000 feet, and the autopilot kept it at that altitude. Once the crew had passed the 5-mile point from the runway, the captain began his descent to the minimum descent altitude of 908 feet above airport elevation. Minimum descent altitude is the lowest altitude that pilots are permitted to descend to. During an approach without having sight of the runway, it differs from airport to airport depending on the presence of hills, buildings, and other obstacles in the vicinity. Staying above the minimum descent altitude, or MDA, is vitally important, as it guarantees that you'll never fly into one of these obstacles when approaching an airport. In the case of Bradley Airport, there was a hill about 2.5 miles from the runway threshold which reached a height of 819 feet at its peak. Approach charts used by the pilots didn't depict this hill. However, rather they just included a single point denoting an 819-foot-high obstacle. This could easily be mistaken for an aerial on top of a hill or some other singular point, which was the only dangerous point of the approach. By contrast, these were the charts provided to pilots at British Airways, which showed the full extent of the terrain surrounding the aircraft in color. Had the pilots of American 1572 been using these charts, they might have conducted this approach somewhat differently. The captain used the vertical speed mode of the autopilot to get the aircraft to descend at 1,000 feet per minute. The plan was that when he reached it, he would press the altitude, hold button, and stay at 908 feet until he could see the runway at 5 minutes to 1, as the crew were just reaching 1,000 feet. The supervisor in the tower got on the radio and issued a wind shear alert to the pilots. Wind shear is a dangerous phenomenon which involves a rapidly changing wind direction. Over a short distance, the pilots had to be even more vigilant from this point. If they encountered wind shear on final approach, they would have to go around immediately. American Airlines. Procedures required the pilot not flying, which in this case was the first officer to call out 3 altitudes during an approach. The first of these was when the aircraft was 1,000 feet above the airport elevation, then when it was 100 feet above the minimum descent altitude, and finally when the aircraft had reached the minimum descent altitude. As the aircraft reached 1,000 feet, the first officer of Flight 1572 called this out, but he did not call out 100 feet above the MD. He did, however, remind the captain as he neared 1,000 feet that 908 feet was the MDA, which served a similar purpose. At this point, the first officer was looking through the windshield trying to locate the airport through the rain when he looked back again at his instruments. He noticed that the aircraft had now slipped below the minimum ascent altitude. He said to the captain, "You're going below your..." In response to this, the captain pushed the altitude hold button on the autopilot at this moment. The sync rate alarm sounded in the cockpit, indicating that the aircraft was descending too rapidly towards the ground below. 4 seconds later, the plane traveling at over 250 kilometers an hour tore through trees on the crest of a hill. The plane shook violently and there was a tremendous noise in the cabin. Branches were ingested into the engines and they began to flame out. The aircraft was still 2.5 miles from the airport. Go around, go round. We're going around, going around. The captain pushed the throttles to maximum power and raised the flaps to 15 degrees. You want the gear up. Yep, the plane's airspeed was now decreasing, and it began to fall towards the ground. Left, motors failed. There's the runway straight ahead. Okay, tell him we're going down. Tell him emergency tower call for emergency equipment. We're going down in the runway. You want the gear back down? Yes, throw it down. Don't think. Oh God, you're gonna make it. Okay, flaps. Put them down. The captain asked the first officer to lower the flaps fully. This was a risky decision. He was hoping that even though this would reduce his airspeed, he would be able to gain a bit of extra lift, which would slow his descent and extend his glide. What do we got? We're still flying. Okay, God, keep going. You're gonna make it. Keep coming. Win 170 at 2. Okay. Yeah, call for emergency. Call for emergency equipment. They're coming. They're coming. You got it. Dude, you're gonna make it. Okay, flaps 40. All the way down. All the way, flaps 40. They're all the way. Okay, hold on, guy. The aircraft clipped the top of a tree near the end of the runway and then smashed through the ILS antenna array before hitting the ground hard on the edge of the stopway. Get it on the deck. Hold it down. Buddy, hold it down. Hold it down. Hold it down. Hold it down. Incredibly, the captain had managed to land his stricken aircraft without causing a single serious injury to anyone on board. He instructed the first officer to shut down the engines and pull the fire handles, which sprayed fire retardant into the engines, extinguishing any fire. He then ordered the aircraft to be evacuated, all past news, and crew had escaped unscathed by one who received minor injuries. Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board determined that the primary cause of the accident was the flight crew's failure to maintain the minimum descent altitude. During the approach, the first officer should never have been looking out the windscreen for the runway. As the plane descended towards the MDA, his job was to carefully watch the instruments as the captain flew the aircraft and to tell the captain when the minimum descent altitude was reached if he had done this, and if the captain had kept the aircraft at the minimum descent altitude, they would never have struck the trees even with the incorrect altimeter setting. Nonetheless, the final report also cited as a contributing cause the flight crew's failure to ask for the current altimeter setting during the approach. If they had received the updated setting of 38 inches of mercury, they would likely not have impacted the trees. The report also said that the controller's failure to provide them with the updated setting was another contributing factor to this accident. The NTSB also criticized the captain's decision to press the altitude hold button when the first officer alerted him to the fact that he had fallen below the MDA. At this point, he should have taken over control of the aircraft from the autopilot and climbed the aircraft back up to the minimum descent altitude. Pressing the altitude hold button meant that the plane continued to round out its descent before stabilizing at an altitude which was still below the MDA. This was an incredibly close call if the altimeter setting had been any more out of date than it was, or if the pilots had continued their ascent for any longer, the aircraft would likely have struck the ridge itself rather than the trees on top of it, leading to a massive loss of life, as damning as the final report is of the crew's failure to recognize and appropriately respond to the descent below the minimum descent altitude. It commended their actions from the moment the aircraft hit the trees. Here's a direct quote from the final report. Regardless of the fact that the flight crew descended below the MDA, their actions after the initial tree strike were noteworthy. The leading edge and the trailing edge flaps of the airplane were severely damaged. Power from one engine failed almost immediately after the tree strike, and power from the other engine failed shortly thereafter. Any mistakes in glide path management, ground track management, or airplane configuration timing by the captain and first officer would probably have caused the airplane to land in unsuitable terrain prior to the clear area at the end of the runway, and undoubtedly would have resulted in more severe injuries to crew and passengers. The safety board concludes that the excellent crew resource management and fight skills that the flight crew used, as reflected on the cockpit voice recorder following their encounter with the trees, were directly responsible for limiting the number of injured passengers to one individual. While the aircraft itself was damaged to the tune of $9 million, it was repaired and continued to fly until 2017, when American Airlines retired it from service. If you'd like to help this channel grow and get some cool perks like early access to new videos, you can do so by tapping on the links here on screen. I'd especially like to thank Joey and Max Sal for their very generous contributions. You can also support the channel by using the link in the description to sign up for a discounted Blinkist membership. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you soon for another episode. You